Hello, Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, members of the City Council, and members of the public. My name is Sherry Klima. I'm your Deputy City Manager, and this is a presentation about weaning off of Measure O. The recommendation is that the City Council adopt a schedule of budget adjustments to programs funded through Measure O in anticipation of the coming 2029 sunset of the Measure O half-cent sales tax. And this we have called throughout the last year and a half weaning. So this is the weaning process off of Measure O. We are more than halfway through Measure O, and we need to start planning for its sunset. Measure O does sunset in November of 2028. When we began this conversation about weaning, there were two purposes for weaning. First of all, Fire Station 8 has debt that continues past the sunset date of Measure O. So we needed to build up the fund balance before that sunset date. And secondly, we were concerned about the continuation of services and the fact that at the end of Measure O, all of the programs would abruptly have to find a new funding source. So we wanted to create, well, assuming that they would continue. So we wanted to create a softer way to move the programs from Measure O into some other funding source. These ongoing discussions have been going with the Measure O Citizen Oversight Committee and with the City Council since the beginning of 2020. And so we talked about this theoretical concept of having to wean. And now we're at the phase of actually making determinations of what is the process by which we will wean. So we first wanted to isolate which projects or programs needed to be weaned off of Measure O. So we're looking only at active projects and only those that are ongoing, because presumably the one-time projects would expend the Measure O funds and end right there. But the projects that are ongoing, meaning the ones that get funding every year for ongoing services, would need to find a new funding source. Secondly, we removed the 5 debt programs and the annual Measure O audit from the weaning list. It's not to say that these don't need to be taken care of. The debt needs to be paid down and the annual Measure O audits need to be completed, but these are not going to transfer onto new funding sources. They're just going to stay in Measure O, the debt until it's paid down and the audits until the end of Measure O. And so that left 24 programs that need to be weaned, or programs that need to be moved onto a new funding source if they're going to continue. That list of 24 programs is in the staff report. The staff originally recommended an 8-year weaning schedule through the termination of Measure O. We wanted to be assertive about this process, but do it in a slow and steady pace. Staff proposed to the Measure O committee 4 possible weaning schedule options, meaning the order by which these programs would be weaned. And those 4 schedule options are explained in more detail in your staff report. The Measure O committee had a robust conversation about these 4 options, and they created a hybrid 5th option, which focused on public safety being weaned first, and the full-time equivalent positions being weaned first also. And then Measure O committee also said that they wanted to recommend a 4-year weaning schedule, a much more aggressive one than staff had recommended. That was in the fall of 2021. In April, Staff returned to the Measure O Citizen Oversight Committee with additional considerations, particularly saying that 4 years was likely too aggressive, in staff's opinion, for the city to wean. And then we proposed a sixth weaning option. The sixth weaning option is the one that is before you tonight. It is the one that the Measure O committee recommended. And it's a 7-year weaning schedule, only because time has passed since our original 8-year schedule. And so we'd like to discuss that option with you tonight. I just want to bracket this whole conversation by saying this is all dependent on the outcome of the Measure N lawsuit. As you know, Measure N Measure N determines that depending on the condition of the streets, Measure O may terminate early. And Measure N was invalidated at the lower court level and is now up on appeal. If Measure N is found to be valid, then we will have to come back to you with a different weaning schedule, because Measure O may not last all the way through the 28-29 fiscal year. If the appellate court upholds the lower court's determination and Measure N is found invalid, then Measure O would continue as originally planned through 28-29, and this would be our proposed weaning schedule. So the way to read this weaning schedule, and the schedule is attached to your staff report, is the items that are in colored blocks are the items that would be weaned each year, moved out of Measure O and into the general fund. So in fiscal year 22-23, we'd be moving Fire Station 8 operations. That's a $4.7.5 million cost, with 21 full-time equivalent positions of firefighters. We'd be moving that to the general fund. In exchange, look at the items listed below in bold in white boxes. If we start to wean items, programs off of Measure O, we don't want the Measure O fund balance to just sit idle and grow. So we do want to use that funding, but we want to use it for one-time expenses that don't later have to be weaned as well. So we propose in fiscal year 22-23 that $2.25 million go into citywide alleyway resurfacing, $300,000 go into technology equipment refreshes and upgrades. $450,000 go into the library Wi-Fi, and then $1.75 million go into the Station 8 bonds. And what that would be is a prepayment on those bonds, in addition to the annual prepayment that we're already making. And in year 2, you'll understand why we're suggesting this. In year 2, in fiscal year 23-24, again, those Fire Station 8 operations, they've already been weaned, and since this is ongoing, that $4.75 million affects every year going forward. That's every year that we would not be spending that out of Measure O. We've already transferred it into the general fund. In year 2, we also suggest moving the enhanced community policing, which is about $3.5 million, and the homeless program, which is about $1.1 million, from Measure O to the general fund. In 23-24, we'd like to spend some of the money that we would be spending on these 3 programs on, again, $2.25 million on citywide alleyway resurfacing. And then, as I alluded to earlier, we'd like to prepay over $7 million on the Station 8 bonds. And that would effectively complete payment on those bonds. We would be complete quite a few years early, and that would save us $2 million. That's $2 million that we could spend toward other projects out of Measure O. In fiscal year 24-25, in addition to the Fire Station 8 operations, in addition to the enhanced community policing and the homeless program, we would also be weaning the CAD RMS operational program and various library programs, and in exchange, doing a series of other improvements. As you can see, the public restroom improvements, more alleyway resurfacing, and then prepaying on the street revenue, the lease revenue street bonds. So this continues for 4 more years. You can look at it as the attachment. And you'll notice that in the outer years, we didn't define the new projects that we'd like to pay for, because we wanted to just sort of leave an open amount for whatever CIP would be relevant then. It's a little difficult in the summer of 22 to anticipate what the city's most important needs will be in the years, 26, 27, 28. So we left those much more generic, to be determined in the future by the future city council. Otherwise, we've got in that list basically the order or sequence that we would be anticipating weaning these programs, again, moving them from Measure O to the general fund. And I might add that as we do that each year, we'd like to really review those programs and determine, A, if they're still critical programs, and B, if the funding amount is still the appropriate amount. It may be that the city council wants to scale back some of those programs, or it may be that you want to make them more robust. In any case, the recommendation is that the city council adopt a schedule of budget adjustments to programs funded through Measure O in anticipation of the coming 2029 sunset of the Measure O half-cent sales tax. Or, in other words, that the city council adopt a weaning schedule for Measure O. I'd be happy to answer your questions at the meeting. Thank you.